Although it's time for Woman's Hour with Jenni Murray.
Now, Naomi Klein came to international attention when she published a book called No Logo. She railed against the brand name culture and the use of sweatshop workers to produce the branded clothes. It was said to have politicised a whole generation. In This Changes Everything, she tackles the controversial subject of climate change, a topic to which she says she came late. I spoke to her earlier from Montreal. What incidents prompted her concern?
I think we are all concerned whether or not we're talking about it. I think there's a sort of a low-level malaise. It's sort of this issue that we are catching glimpses of out of the corner of our eye, that we're always kind of looking away from it because it's so overwhelming. But for me, it really was Hurricane Katrina. I really felt when I was in New Orleans in the midst of the flood, actually, I was there when the city was still flooded and spent a few weeks reporting from there, returned several times. I felt like I was looking at the future for all of us if we don't change course. Because in New Orleans, you had this collision between heavy weather, and you can never connect one storm to climate change, but we do know that warming oceans produce more powerful hurricanes, and Katrina was an incredibly powerful hurricane. But that storm collided with weak and neglected public infrastructure, and that's what really turned it into a catastrophe. The levees broke, and then the state, the arms of government that are charged with taking care of people in the midst of disaster, just abandoned them. People were abandoned on their rooftops. They were abandoned in the Superdome. And you had this kind of science fiction dystopic reality where, if you had money, you were taken care of, you had private security, you had all of these private protections. But if you depended on the state, you were vilified as looters and then turned into internal refugees. So it was seeing that possible future that made me want to write a book that answered a question that I came across a lot when I was touring with the shock doctrine, which is, how do we prevent this tactic? Is there a way of responding to crisis that brings us together as opposed to apart, that builds a fairer society instead of a more unequal one?
One of the things you say really worried and upset you. You say you were worried about your son never seeing a moose. Why did you concern yourself with the moose?
Well, writing this book took 5 years, and over the course of that 5 years, I became a mother. And one of the things about the way we talk about climate change is that it's very kind of clinical, and it's a really jargon-laden world, right? You've got the scientific jargon, then you've got the policy jargon, the feed-in tariffs and the cap-and-trades, and then you've got the United Nations jargon of IPCCs and UNFCCCs. And so there's this real distancing that happens. So even though I was totally immersed in the scientific material, the climate models, there was a way that it wasn't really reaching me emotionally. And I found that what really snuck up on me and made this real for me was when I would take breaks from writing the book and go and read stories to my then 1-year-old. And children's literature is filled with animals. And I guess it was probably the first time I ever cried about climate change was when I was reading my son a book called Looking for a Moose, which I had actually read him 100 times before as his favorite book, about a group of kids that desperately wants to see a moose, and they look high and low. And the joke is that there's a moose hiding on every page, but they don't see it. And then at the very end, all the moose come out of hiding, and all the kids go, "We've never, ever, ever, ever seen so many moose." And then suddenly it hit me that he may never see a moose, because there's an extinction crisis going on with moose in North America, and they are one of the most climate vulnerable species. Just suddenly this topic that I thought I was scared about became terrifying.
Now, I know that you're not altogether fond of the capitalist system from having read No Logo, but why do you see the root of climate change as a sort of battle between capitalism and the planet?
If we want to understand why we have failed so catastrophically to meet this crisis, even though we've known about it and we've been warned about it now for 2.5 decades. I mean, scientists have known about it for much longer, but this really became a mainstream, top of consciousness issue in the late 1980s. So what I do in the book is look at what else was happening and conclude that the reason why we have failed is because this crisis has a catastrophically bad case of bad timing, because 1988 was the high point of the end of history moment. This was when Francis Fukuyama was declaring history over. Margaret Thatcher had said there is no such thing as society. The Berlin Wall fell the next year. And the reason why this matters is because the ideological project that was being locked in this period made it extremely difficult for us to do the things that are necessary in the face of the climate crisis. Regulation became a dirty word. Of course, we need to regulate corporations. We need to tell them that they can't emit CO2 at the levels that they've been doing it. Instead, we had all of these sort of smoke and mirrors, cap and trade and emission trade, and we tried to get it to adhere to the logic of the market. We also were privatizing our energy systems, our transit systems, and these are the parts of the state that are central to any kind of energy transition. We need to reimagine our transit system, switch to renewable energy to power, mass transit. We need it to be affordable. It can't be profit driven because we need everybody to use it. But here we were selling it off. So the argument I make is that that particular sort of no-holds-barred capitalism is what made us fail to act, but also we were celebrating this very, very high consumer lifestyle and exporting it to every corner of the world. So, of course, that led to an emission increase. It's not that we didn't do anything, it's that we made things much, much worse. Global emissions went up by 60% in the years when we were supposed to be lowering emissions.
There are, of course, climate change deniers. How do you deal with their rejection of your research?
I think there's such a high degree of scientific consensus. 97% of active climate scientists agree that human-caused climate change is real. I have a chapter in the book on the climate change denier movement. It's born in these right-wing think tanks in the United States. Heartland, which hosts these conferences, notably is not a scientific organization. It is a free market think tank. And when you go to these gatherings, you see the intellectual think tanks that have advanced the project that I've been describing: deregulation, privatization, austerity, free trade. So, of course, they reject the science, because if the science is true, and we really are in the midst of an existential emergency, and we are, then their entire intellectual scaffolding falls apart. Their ideology cannot survive, and they know it. So I don't honestly spend much time debating climate scientists, nor do I think major media outlets should. I think there are huge debates to be had about how we respond, but I don't think we should be debating whether or not there is a crisis. I think we don't have that kind of time to waste.
What do you say then to people who say, well, I have to fly to get on my holiday or to do my business. I have to drive my car to get to my appointment. I hate wind farms.
Well, it's really interesting about wind turbines and the pushback on it. There's been some research about this that finds that when communities have control over the development of wind and solar in their areas, there's much more public support. And if you look at countries that have embraced wind on a very large scale, like Germany and Denmark, what's notable about those cases is that there are hundreds of energy co-ops that have emerged in Germany as part of the transition. In Denmark, 40% of the electricity comes from renewables. Much of it is wind, but a great deal of it is owned by co-ops and municipalities. The NIMBY phenomenon, the not in my backyard phenomenon, does not exist in Denmark, and it doesn't exist in Germany. People want the wind farms on their land because they're benefiting from them and they feel a sense of democratic control over them.
And those of us who embrace modern life and continue to fly and drive.
This book is not one of those environmental books that makes the issue all about whether you personally recycle and what your personal carbon footprint is, which is not to say that that isn't important, but I think that the much larger issue is that most people don't have the ability to make good decisions. We haven't made it easy for people. So I think that we've made a mistake by focusing so much on those individual shopping decisions and not enough on what the bold public policies need to be so that all of us have better choices about how we move around. And we need to stop, I think, scapegoating individuals and saying, well, this is all just because we're greedy. And this idea that this is an anti-modern position, I also think I'd like to push back a little bit on, because the kind of transition that I'm talking about relies on extremely modern, exciting technologies. And there have been huge advances in renewable energy and battery storage in recent years. So we're not talking about going backwards. We're talking about smart technologies that respect the limits of our natural system and how much pollution our systems can absorb.
And how soon do you expect governments, after 20 years of talking about this, not making much progress, do you expect your this changes everything to happen?
Well, look, it's not just mine. I mean, the final section of the book is all about this new wave of climate activism that has emerged in recent years, whether it is communities banding together to refuse fracking in their backyard, whether it's university students demanding that their schools divest their holdings from fossil fuels, whether it's the 400,000 people who marched in New York City in September demanding climate action and climate justice. There is a growing movement, and it's winning some significant victories. I mean, we've seen Obama stand up to the Republicans again and again over the Keystone XL pipeline. This is quite unexpected, and it's very much a victory of this grassroots movement. So there is progress, but it's a race against time. The movement is growing. It's growing very quickly, but we have to get this turned around in the right direction by the end of this decade. So I think that the climate talks in Paris this year are really significant. And the fact that there is this UN climate summit is becoming a catalyst for the anti-austerity movement to join very strongly with the climate justice movement. In a time when we're facing a crisis of this magnitude, I have a lot of hope in that coalition coming together.
I was talking to Naomi Klein.